Most of us look at the monarch butterfly and just see a fragile, delicate insect floating on the breeze, right? But when we systematically analyze the data, a completely different, much more complex reality emerges. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to rigorously test our assumptions by exploring the monarch paradox, how an insect that is literally built like a biological fortress is somehow facing a complete systemic breakdown. Let's look at the facts.
Here is our analytical roadmap for today. We'll start by examining their evolutionary arsenal, followed by their multi-generational migratory mechanics. Then we'll test the vulnerabilities of their milkweed dependency, map out human-caused systemic threats, identify the overwintering bottleneck, and finally, lock in on some critical, actionable conservation realities.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the evolutionary arsenal, a biological fortress.
Now look at the incredibly rapid pace of this life cycle. In optimal conditions, they transition from an egg to a fully formed adult in just about a month. And they have to be exactly this fast because the reality of their environment is relentlessly harsh. Statistically, fewer than 10% of monarch eggs and caterpillars actually survive. So to combat that massive systemic attrition rate, the monarch had to evolve some extremely serious countermeasures.
To protect themselves, they actually weaponize their own food source. Monarch caterpillars feed entirely on milkweed, which happens to contain highly toxic steroids called cardinalides. And they don't just digest this material, they strategically store it. By the time they emerge as adult butterflies, they're packing these heart-arresting toxins right in their wings and abdomen. It's a brilliant deterrent. If a bird tries to take a bite, it gets a foul taste and a highly potent dose of poison. But logically, you have to ask, how do they survive eating poison all day without it killing them? Well, let's look at the hard genetic data. Recent genome sequencing and CRISPR tests have verified something incredible. The monarch possesses 3 specific targeted mutations in a key enzyme. This isn't just a slight behavioral adaptation, it is literally molecularly engineered resistance. These mutations give them total systemic immunity to the milkweed's toxins.
Moving on to Section 2, multi-generational migratory mechanics, the biological trigger.
Now, we often assume migration is just a behavioral choice, but we need to correct that blind spot. It is a complex, data-verified genetic trigger. If you analyze their DNA, there is zero structural difference between a migrating and a non-migrating monarch. The entire mechanism relies on gene expression. In the fall, specific environmental cues trigger their migratory genes, which completely delays their sexual maturity. That allows them to channel all their biological energy into flying up to 2,800 miles. But the summer generations, those exact same genes stay unexpressed. They mature in days, and they live short lives optimized purely for rapid local breeding. Let's move to Section 3, the milkweed dependency, the fatal vulnerability. So, as we've established, monarch caterpillars are entirely hyper-dependent on milkweed. Without it, the entire biological fortress just crumbles. They have no food and absolutely zero chemical defense. From an analytical standpoint, that makes the geographic availability and the health of this one specific plant a single point of failure, an existential requirement for the entire species. And here is where we identify a massive flaw in public perception. Because they need milkweed so badly, well-intentioned people assume that planting any milkweed is a net positive. The data proves otherwise. Native milkweeds go through natural senescence. They die back in the winter, which forces the butterflies to migrate and naturally breaks the cycle of a deadly parasite called OE. But non-native tropical milkweed, it stays green year-round. It actually traps the butterflies, tricking them into staying and breeding out of season. It acts as a massive biological vector that drastically increases the spread of this fatal parasite.
Section 4. Anthropogenic systemic threats, exposing the incoherencies.
95%. That is a staggering, undeniable metric. We are looking at a 95% decline of the western migratory population in California since the 1980s. And the eastern population that winters in Mexico? It's similarly plummeted by roughly 80%. We have to be objective here. These are not natural seasonal fluctuations. These numbers point directly to a systemic collapse.
So what is the root cause driving this? We can directly correlate this collapse with a massive structural shift in agriculture, the near total 95% adoption of glyphosate-resistant crops. This technology allowed for aerial herbicide spraying, which systematically eradicated the native milkweed that historically thrived along agricultural margins. The net result? 120 to 150 million acres of Midwest breeding habitat completely wiped off the map. You combine that immense habitat loss with widespread insecticide exposure and shifting climates, and you have a perfect formula for systemic breakdown.
This brings us to another critical incoherency in human intervention. A lot of people try to save the monarch by raising them indoors. But when you test this hypothesis and compare wild versus captive-reared monarchs, the data shows that unregulated human handling actually alters their natural defensive behaviors and weakens their genetics. Captive rearing completely bypasses natural selection, it introduces mutations, and it objectively reduces their ability to successfully migrate. We simply cannot fix a massive continental habitat deficit with localized indoor rearing.
Moving to Section 5, the overwintering bottleneck, the data anomaly.
If we analyze the life stages, we find a fascinating anomaly in the data. Measure the summer breeding populations up in Canada and the northern US, and the numbers are actually holding relatively stable. But as soon as you evaluate the overwintering numbers in Mexico and California, you hit that 80 to 95% collapse. This data tells us exactly where the operational failure is occurring. They are surviving the summer breeding season, but they are experiencing massive, catastrophic attrition during the migration journey and at their winter habitats. Let's put a hard, quantifiable metric on just one of those migratory hazards. Studies reveal that 200,000 monarchs are killed annually by car strikes at just 2 specific highway crossing hotspots in northern Mexico. When you funnel an entire continental population through highly specific, narrow geographical bottlenecks, our modern infrastructure becomes a highly concentrated, devastating threat.
Finally, Section 6, critical conservation realities, actionable synthesis. So, based on this rigorous analysis, how do we systematically course correct? We need a clear, actionable plan, not generalized platitudes. Here are the 4 data-backed steps to reverse the decline. 1. Cultivate strictly native milkweed and late-flowering nectar plants. Eliminate the tropical variants entirely. 2. Aggressively reduce and eliminate the use of glyphosate and non-target insecticides that are functionally sterilizing these habitats. 3. We must systematically protect and expand those highly vulnerable overwintering forests in Mexico and California. And 4. Cease unregulated captive rearing. We have to allow natural selection to maintain the biological integrity of the species.
We have engineered our modern agricultural and infrastructural systems for absolute maximal efficiency. But as an analytical thinker, you have to look at the collateral damage and ask, what is the true cost of that footprint? If our drive for maximized efficiency can systematically dismantle an organism equipped with millions of years of evolutionary armor, a literal biological fortress, what is the true opportunity cost here? And more importantly, what other systems are we blindly dismantling without even realizing it? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. You now have the objective data to understand the monarch's systemic vulnerabilities and the actionable strategy required to actually fix it.